The wind howled through the valley, a relentless force that carried with it the biting chill of winter. Snowflakes, sharp as tiny daggers, danced wildly in the air, stinging against Emily Dawson's exposed cheeks as she trudged forward. Her boots sank deep with every step, swallowed by the thick snow that stretched endlessly before her. The sky above was a heavy gray, the kind that warned of an impending blizzard, a warning she did not have the luxury of heeding. Emily's breath formed small, fleeting clouds in the freezing air as she adjusted the axe slung across her back. Her fingers, despite being wrapped in worn-out gloves, had started to stiffen from a cold. She pulled her tattered coat tighter around her frame, but the fabric was thin, offering little protection against the brutal Alaskan winter. The cold seeped in her bones, but she pressed on. She had wandered farther than usual today, deeper into the forest at the mountain's base, desperate to gather enough firewood before nightfall. It was a dangerous risk. Straying too far meant braving the storm that loomed over the horizon. Yet returning empty-handed meant an even deadlier fate, freezing inside the cabin before winter had even reached its peak. The towering pines swayed and groaned under the weight of the wind, their dark forms barely visible through the whirling snow. The forest was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustle of unseen creatures moving beneath the blanket of white. Emily knew these woods well. She had lived here her entire life, growing up in the same small, weather-worn cabin with her grandmother, Martha Dawson, who had taught her everything she knew about survival. Chopping wood, hunting for food, making medicine from wild herbs. These were the only skills that had kept them alive in a place where the rest of the world had long since turned its back. They had no electricity, no luxuries, only the land and their will to endure. Emily never allowed herself to think of what life might have been like elsewhere. The thought of a different life, a softer life, was a dangerous indulgence she couldn't afford. As she bent to pick up a fallen branch, she heard it. A sound, faint, barely audible over the wailing wind. A low, guttural moan. She froze. Her breath hitched. For a long moment, she stood motionless, straining to hear beyond the howling storm. Nothing, just the relentless wind. Maybe it had been her imagination, a trick of the cold playing with her senses. But then, there was again. A weak, pain-laced groan. Emily's pulse quickened. Someone was out here. She turned, scanning the endless white, but the storm had already thickened, obscuring her vision. The sound was close, yet with the wind screaming through the trees, it was impossible to pinpoint where it had come from. "Hello," she called, her voice swallowed almost instantly by the storm. No answer. She hesitated. Common sense told her to turn back. Out here, there were no good reasons for a stranger to be wandering alone. If they were lost, they were already dead. If they were dangerous, she could be walking straight into a trap. But her instincts screamed otherwise. Someone was hurt. Bracing herself against the wind, she pressed forward. Her boots crunched against the ice-crusted snow as she moved cautiously, her eyes darting across the terrain. The world around her blurred into shades of white and gray. But then, something dark caught her eye. At first, it was barely noticeable, a small disturbance in the snow, a shape that did not belong. Her breath hitched as she hurried toward it, stumbling to her knees beside the motionless figure buried beneath a mound of fresh snow. Brushing the frost away with shaking hands, she uncovered a man's face, pale, barely conscious. His dark hair was frozen at the edges, his lips tinged blue. His clothes, though of expensive material, were torn and soaked through, offering him no protection against the brutal cold. Emily's stomach twisted. How long had he been out here? "Hey," she breathed, shaking his shoulder gently. "Can you hear me?" Nothing. Panic surged through her. His fingers were stiff with frostbite, his body alarmingly still. She pressed her gloved hand against his cheek, ice cold. "Wake up," she urged, shaking him harder. "You have to wake up, or you'll die out here." A faint sound escaped his lips, barely more than a whisper. A single word. "Help!" Emily clenched her jaw. There was no time. She scanned his body quickly, his leg. Her breath caught when she saw the deep gash running along his shin. The wound raw, and red against his frozen skin. Broken, bleeding. He wouldn't survive much longer in this state. Damn it, she muttered under her breath. He was heavier than he looked, dead weight against the snow as she struggled to lift him. She gritted her teeth, shifting his arm over her shoulder, adjusting her stance. "I'm not leaving you here," she whispered, more to herself than to him. The wind screamed through the valley as she staggered forward, each step a battle against the deep snow. The man's head lolled against her shoulder, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Emily refused to stop. She had no idea who he was or how he had ended up here, but none of that mattered now. All that mattered was getting him home, before the cold claimed him forever. The journey back to the cabin was a brutal battle against the storm. Emily gritted her teeth, her muscles burning as she hauled the unconscious man forward, his body heavy with dead weight. The wind roared through the trees, slashing against her exposed skin like icy whips, but she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The snow was knee-deep, pulling at her legs, trying to drag her down with each agonizing step. The man's head lolled against her shoulder, his breath coming in shallow gasps. At least he was still breathing. But for how much longer? Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, competing with the howling storm. She had to move faster. The cabin wasn't far now, just past the clearing tucked between the trees where the land dipped into a small valley. She could already see the faint glow of firelight through the frosted window. Home. Safety. With a final surge of strength, she reached the porch, nearly collapsing as she kicked the door open. The warm air inside hit her like a wave, a stark contrast to the freezing wilderness she had just battled through. Staggering forward, she dragged the man inside and let him fall onto the old wooden couch near the fireplace. For a moment, she stood there, gasping for breath, her limbs trembling from exhaustion. Snow clung to her clothes, melting into damp patches against her skin. The room was dimly lit, the fire casting flickering shadows along the wooden walls. The scent of pine and smoke filled the air, familiar and grounding. Emily turned, her gaze falling on the half-frozen stranger sprawled on the couch. He was deathly pale, his dark hair matted with frost, his body motionless. She had to act fast. Rushing to the hearth, she grabbed the pile of blankets stacked in the corner and wrapped them tightly around him, layering them one after another. His fingers were stiff, the tips showing the early signs of frostbite. His clothes, ripped, wet, and utterly useless, offered him no protection from the cold that had seeped into his bones. Kneeling beside him, she carefully unwrapped his torn coat, her hands working swiftly as she assessed the damage. His leg was the worst of it. The gash along his shin was deep, angry, the skin raw where the ice had kept the bleeding at bay. She sucked in a sharp breath. If this wound got infected, he wouldn't survive long. Dipping a cloth into the bowl of warm water, she began cleaning the wound. The moment the heat touched his skin, he let out a faint groan, his body tensing slightly before falling limp again. At least he could still feel pain. That was something. The minutes stretched on in silence, as Emily worked with steady hands, her focus unwavering. She stitched the wound with careful precision, her fingers moving swiftly, her mind blocking out the sight of torn flesh. When it was done, she wrapped his leg in clean bandages and let out a slow breath. Now all she could do was wait. She leaned back, her gaze drifting to his face. Even in unconsciousness, his features were sharp, almost noble, a strong jawline, high cheekbones, the kind of face that didn't belong to a man lost in the wilderness. She had seen enough rough travelers, enough drifters passing through, to know that he was different. And then there was the question she couldn't shake. Who was he? The hours dragged on. Emily sat in her old wooden chair, watching the man with quiet wariness. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, the fire crackled softly, the only sound in the cabin besides his slow, steady breathing. His color had returned slightly, the bluish tint fading from his lips. That was a good sign. She didn't know why she had risked her life dragging a stranger through the snow. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was because she had been taught that in a place like this, you didn't leave people to die. Not even people you didn't know. A soft noise stirred the air. Emily's eyes snapped to the couch. The man shifted, his brows drawing together in a slight frown. His fingers twitched against the blanket. Then, after a long moment, his eyelids fluttered open. For a second, he just stared, his gaze unfocused, lost. Then his eyes, stormy gray, sharp despite the haze of exhaustion, darted around the room, confusion flickering across his features. Emily stood, crossing the small space between them. "You're awake." His eyes found hers, and for a moment, he just blinked, as if trying to make sense of where he was, of who she was. He opened his mouth, but his voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Where am I?" "My cabin." Emily kept her voice even. "I found you half dead in the snow." He exhaled sharply, pressing a hand to his temple, his expression pinched as if he were fighting against a pounding headache. I don't remember." Emily narrowed her eyes. A lie? Or was his memory truly gone? "What's your name?" she pressed. He hesitated. A long pause. Then, "Richard." He swallowed, his voice rough. "Richard Caldwell." Something about the name sent a flicker of recognition through her, though she couldn't quite place it. It sounded familiar, but she didn't dwell on it. "You were in bad shape when I found you," she said, crossing her arms. "Your leg was messed up, and you had no supplies." "No protegia." "What the hell were you doing out there?" Richard exhaled, his jaw tightening. His hand moved to his bandaged leg, his fingers brushing against the fabric as though trying to piece together the fragments of his memory. I don't know." He shook his head, frustration darkening his features. "I remember the cold, the storm, and then..." His face twisted, as if trying to force the memories back. "Everything else is a blur." Emily studied him carefully. She wasn't sure if he was lying or genuinely lost. Either way, something about his situation didn't sit right with her. Then his expression shifted, his eyes widening slightly as his hands patted at his coat, searching. "My phone." His voice sharpened. "My wallet." "Where the hell?" He froze, realization hitting him like a blow. His breath turned unsteady. "They're gone." Emily's stomach tightened. "They weren't on you when I found you," she said carefully. Richard's jaw clenched, his expression hardening in a way that sent a ripple of unease through her. No, I had them," he muttered, his voice more to himself than to her. "I remember. I had my phone, my wallet, my watch. I never go anywhere without them." Emily frowned. "You think someone robbed you?" Richard let out a bitter laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Seems like the only explanation, doesn't it?" A heavy silence settled between them. Emily had seen enough in her life to know what this meant. Someone had left him out there to die. If that was true, then Richard Caldwell had more than just the wilderness to fear. The door creaked open. Emily turned just as Martha Dawson stepped inside, wrapped in thick furs, her sharp blue eyes locking onto Richard with a calculating gaze. "So," Martha said, her voice lined with both curiosity and skepticism, "this is the stranger you dragged in from the snow." Emily straightened. "Grandma, this is Richard." "Richard, this is Martha Dawson." Richard gave a small nod, attempting to shift himself into a more upright position, but Martha barely acknowledged him. She stepped closer, taking a long, scrutinizing look at him before turning back to Emily. "He shouldn't be here." Emily clenched her jaw. "I couldn't just leave him to die." Martha sighed, untying her fur-lined hood. "You're too soft-hearted, child. Strangers mean trouble." Emily didn't argue, but she had made her choice. She wasn't turning him away. Not yet. The days passed slowly in the cabin, marked by the rhythmic crackling of the fire and the occasional gusts of wind rattling the wooden shutters. Richard's strength returned bit by bit, though his injured leg kept him confined to the couch for the first few days. He hated the helplessness of it, hated being useless. Emily barely spoke to him unless necessary. She was always moving, working, doing something. Chopping wood, checking traps, preparing food, living. He had spent his entire life surrounded by assistants, employees, people who answered to him at a single command. Yet here he was, watching a woman half his size do more in one day than he had ever done with his own hands of his entire life. By the time he was able to stand on his own, limping but functional, he made a decision. He couldn't just sit there any longer. He had to do something. The first morning he stepped outside, the cold hit him like a slap to the face. The air was sharper than any New York winter, biting through his borrowed woolen coat. His breath curled in the air as he took in the untouched expanse of wilderness stretching before him. Towering pines, snow-covered hills, a world that didn't belong to men in suits but to something wilder, older. Emily was already by the woodpile, splitting logs with effortless precision. Thud, crack, thud. Each swing of the axe sent a sharp echo into the quiet morning. Richard approached, feeling ridiculously out of place. You planning to just stand there, city boy? Or are you going to make yourself useful? Emily didn't even glance up, her voice carrying that familiar mix of teasing and indifference. Richard exhaled, rolling his shoulders. You going to teach me, or am I supposed to figure it out by trial and error? Emily smirked, finally looking up. Oh, this should be good. She tossed him an axe. He caught it barely. It was heavier than it looked. All right, she said, stepping back. Split the log. Richard positioned himself, gripping the handle tightly. He swung with confidence. The blade hit the wood with a dull thud, barely making a dent. Emily winced. That was painful to watch. Richard groaned, adjusting his stance. He swung again, same result. The log sat there, mocking him. Emily crossed her arms, clearly holding back laughter. You don't have to hit it like it insulted your stock portfolio. Richard shot her a glare, but he couldn't stop the small grin that tugged at the corner of his lips. He tried again, and again. By the fifth attempt, he was sweating despite the cold. His shoulders burned, his arms ached, and his pride had taken a serious beating. All right, Emily said finally, stepping forward. Here, adjust your grip. She reached for his hands, shifting them slightly on the handle. Her fingers were rough, but warm, steady. Richard found himself momentarily distracted by how close she was, the way her breath curled in the cold air between them. Plant your feet. Her voice was softer now, more patient. Use your whole body, not just your arms. Try again. He swallowed hard and focused. This time, when he swung the axe, the log split cleanly in two. Emily grinned. There you go. Richard stared at the broken pieces. It was such a small thing, but something about it sent an unfamiliar spark of satisfaction through him. He had spent his life making billion-dollar deals, managing entire corporations, things people considered achievements. But none of those victories had ever felt this tangible. Maybe there was something to this whole working with your hands thing after all. A new routine. The days blurred into a new kind of rhythm. Richard still limped on his bad leg, but that didn't stop him from trying to help. Emily didn't coddle him. If he wanted to work, she let him, fetching water from the frozen stream, patching up the old wooden roof, setting traps in the forest. At first, he was terrible at all of it. The first time he tried to set a snare, he ended up tangled in his own rope. Emily nearly doubled over laughing. God help you if you ever have to survive on your own. But with time, he got better. He learned. Slowly but surely, Richard found himself watching Emily more closely. Not just the way she worked, but the way she moved through the world. The way she was so sure of herself, so self-reliant, so unshaken. He had spent his entire life around people who chased power, who measured success in dollars and status. But Emily, she had nothing, and yet she had everything. One night, as they sat by the fire, Richard looked at her and finally said the thing that had been turning in his mind for days. You live like this every day? Emily glanced at him over the rim of her tin cup. Like what? Hunting for food, making your own medicine, chopping wood just to keep warm. She shrugged. It's not easy, but it's life. Richard stirred the stew in his bowl absent-mindedly. I don't think I've ever had to work that hard for anything. Martha, who had been sitting quietly by the stove, let out a snort. Doesn't surprise me. Richard chuckled, shaking his head. Yeah, me neither. Emily watched him for a long moment. There was something strange about seeing a man who clearly came from wealth sitting at their modest table, eating their simple food. He didn't belong here, but at the same time, he didn't seem to want to leave. The bear. The first time Richard went hunting, it was a disaster. Emily had led him deep into the woods, moving like a shadow between the trees. Richard, on the other hand, stepped on every twig, made every possible noise. They tracked a rabbit for nearly an hour. When the moment came, Emily nudged him. "All right, city boy, take your shot." Richard exhaled, pulled back the bowstring, and released. The arrow missed by a mile. Emily winced. "Okay, that was painful to watch." Richard groaned, rubbing his forehead. "Maybe I should stick to real estate." She just laughed. "Come on, we'll try again later." But then something shifted in the air. The birds stopped chirping. The wind stilled. Emily froze. Richard frowned. "What is it?" Then he heard it. A deep, guttural growl. His blood turned to ice. Slowly, he turned his head, just in time to see the massive grizzly bear emerge from the underbrush. The bear's dark eyes locked onto them. Its muscles tensed. Richard's heartbeat hammered in his chest. His body locked up, every instinct screaming at him to run. But he knew, you don't run from a bear. Emily reacted first. Fast, controlled. "Slowly move back," she whispered. Richard did as she said, his breath uneven. But the bear stepped forward. Then suddenly, it charged. Richard barely had time to react before Emily shoved him behind a tree. In one fluid motion, she raised her rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The deafening crack of the bullet shattered the silence. The bear skidded to a stop, ears flattening. It hesitated, huffed. Then, finally, it turned and lumbered away. Richard's hands were shaking as he pressed himself against the tree. He had never, never, felt fear like that before. Emily exhaled slowly, lowering her gun. Then, smirking, she glanced at him. "Welcome to Alaska." Richard let out a breathless laugh, still trying to steady his nerves. For the first time in his life, someone had risked everything to save him. And he knew no one had ever done that before. The fire crackled softly, filling the cabin with a warm, flickering glow. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving an unsettling stillness in its wake. Richard sat at the small wooden table, staring at his hands, his expression distant. Emily, seated across from him, watched him in quiet curiosity. She had grown used to the way he observed things now. The way his gaze lingered a little longer on the world around him, as if trying to understand something that had always been just out of reach. But tonight, he wasn't focused on the fire or the way the cabin smelled of pine and smoke. He was lost in something else, something far deeper. "You look like a man who's just figured something out," Emily finally said. Richard exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "I think I know why I was out there. Why I nearly died." Emily straightened slightly. "Go on." He let out a slow breath, as if preparing himself for the words before he spoke them. "Before I woke up in the snow, I was in Alaska for a business meeting. My company, Caldwell Enterprises, was negotiating a deal to acquire a mining operation, a gold mine." He paused, his fingers tightening slightly against the wooden table. "It's one of the last untouched reserves in the region. Billions of dollars in untapped resources. My company had been working on the deal for months." Emily's brow furrowed, something in her expression shifting. "And let me guess," she said, her voice edged with skepticism. "The deal wasn't exactly clean." Richard hesitated. The truth was, he hadn't given much thought to the ethics of his business dealings before. There were lawyers, advisors, people who handled the finer details. But now, sitting here, seeing the world through her eyes, it felt different. The negotiations were intense, he admitted. Not everyone wanted me to get control of the mine. There were other investors, competitors, people who stood to gain if I disappeared. Emily leaned forward slightly, her green eyes narrowing. "You think someone tried to get rid of you?" Richard clenched his jaw. The realization had been gnawing at him for days, memories surfacing in fragmented pieces. But now, they were coming together with startling clarity. "Not just someone," he said, his voice quiet, firm. "I think it was my own assistant." Emily stilled. "Your assistant?" Richard's hands curled into fists. "Jonathan Reed, my right-hand man. The one person I trusted to handle everything. My schedule, my travel, my security." His breath came out sharp, bitter. "And the last person I saw before waking up in the snow." The memory hit like a punch to the gut. a private lodge near Fairbanks, a roaring fire in the stone fireplace, the scent of expensive whiskey in the air. Jonathan standing by the window, the faint glow of the snowy landscape reflecting in the glass. "Everything is set," he had said, pouring Richard a drink. "By this time tomorrow, the mine will be yours." Richard had taken a glass, nodding. "Good. I don't want any surprises." Jonathan had smiled. That same smile Richard had seen 100 times before. The kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Of course," he had said smoothly. "You can always trust me." Then darkness. A sharp pain in his skull. The bitter taste of something in his drink. The world spinning. The cold. The blinding white of the snow. Richard gritted his teeth, his pulse hammering in his ears. He must have drugged me. Left me out there, knowing I wouldn't survive. By the time they declare me missing, the deal would have already been signed without me. Emily's expression darkened. "So he tried to kill you. For money." Richard let out a humorless laugh. "That's the world I come from." Emily shook her head, disgust flickering across her face. "Unbelievable. And to think you actually trusted this guy." Richard exhaled slowly, running a hand through his dark hair. "Yeah," he admitted. "I did." The silence between them was heavy. The fire crackled, filling the space where words failed. Finally, Emily spoke. "So what are you going to do?" Richard looked up, his gray eyes dark with determination. "I have to go back." Emily's jaw tensed. She didn't say anything at first, just leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, watching him. "Right," she said after a long moment. "Of course. Go back to your world of power and money." Richard frowned. "I don't have a choice. If I don't stop him, he'll take everything I've built. He'll win." Emily let out a slow breath, shaking her head. "And what happens after that?" Her voice was unreadable. "You fix your business, put the bad guy in jail, and go back to your fancy penthouse in New York." Richard hesitated. He hadn't thought that far ahead. All he knew was that he couldn't let this betrayal stand. But now, looking at Emily, at this life, the one he had come to respect in ways he never expected, a strange unease settled in his chest. Emily studied him for a long moment. Then, without a word, she stood and disappeared into the small adjoining room. When she returned, she held something small in her palm. She reached for his hand, pressing a silver compass into it. Richard looked down, his brows furrowing slightly. "My grandfather's," Emily said, her voice quieter now. "He used to say it would always point him home." Richard swallowed, his throat tightening. He curled his fingers around the compass, the weight of it heavier than it should have been. He looked up, meeting her gaze. "And where's home for you?" Emily held his stare. "You better figure it out." A long silence stretched between them, something unspoken lingering in the air. Finally, Richard nodded. "A promise. A vow. I will come back." Emily didn't look away. She didn't say anything for a moment, but then, just once, she nodded. That was all he needed, because for the first time in his life, Richard Caldwell had something worth coming back for. The city was exactly as he had left it. Loud, relentless, suffocating. Richard stepped out of the sleek black car, his polished shoes meeting the marble pavement in front of Caldwell Enterprises. The towering glass skyscraper loomed above him, reflecting the restless energy of New York, a world that had once been his entire identity. Now, standing there, the weight of everything he had learned in the wilderness pressed heavy against his chest. He walked through the lobby, past employees who did double takes at the sight of him, the man they thought was dead. The elevator ride to the top floor was silent, except for the soft hum of the city beneath him. He could feel it, the anticipation, the moment before a storm breaks. The doors slid open. Jonathan Reed sat in his chair, behind his desk. For a moment, Jonathan didn't react. Then, slowly he stood. "Richard," Jonathan said, a smile creeping onto his face, as if he had rehearsed this moment. "You're alive." "My God, I thought." "Cut the act," Richard said. His voice was cold, sharper than Jonathan had ever heard it. "We both know what you did." Jonathan exhaled, his fake concern slipping away. He tilted his head, regarding Richard like an opponent on a chessboard. "I don't know what you're talking about." Richard stepped closer, his hands tightening at his sides. You drugged me. You left me in the snow to die, hoping no one would ever find me." His voice was steel, but someone did. Jonathan's expression flickered for the briefest second, a crack in the facade. "Prove it," he said smoothly. "You have no evidence, no weaknesses, just a wild story about being lost in the Alaskan wilderness. Who do you think the board is going to believe?" Richard smirked. "I don't need them to believe me. I just need them to believe this." He reached into his pocket and tossed a USB drive onto the desk. Jonathan's face paled. "It's funny," Richard continued. "You got sloppy. Thought I was dead, so you didn't bother covering your tracks. Paper trails, offshore accounts, a little too much movement in company shares right before my accident." He leaned in, voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Turns out, people talk when they realize they backed the wrong side." Jonathan swallowed, but Richard wasn't finished. "You're done." His voice was final. "I already filed charges. The SEC is investigating your financials as we speak. The board is voting on your removal." Jonathan scoffed, his desperation surfacing. "You think you could just take everything back? You've been gone for weeks. This company isn't yours anymore." Richard smiled, a slow, dangerous smile. "Watch me." And just like that, Jonathan Reed was finished. The city had never felt smaller. A new purpose. Days turned into weeks. Richard reclaimed control of Caldwell Enterprises, but it didn't feel the same. The offices, the boardrooms, the endless stream of meaningless conversations about profit margins and market trends, it all fell hollow. He had come back to fight for what was his, and he had won. But standing in the middle of his penthouse, staring out at the glittering skyline, he felt more lost than ever. It wasn't enough. He thought of Emily, of her cabin in the woods, of the fire crackling in the hearth, the smell of pine and smoke. He thought of the way she moved through the world, strong, independent, unshaken. She had been right. Money meant nothing when you were freezing to death in the snow. He couldn't just go back to business as usual. So instead, he built something new, the Dawson Initiative, a foundation for rural communities, not just in Alaska, but across the country, places forgotten by the rest of the world. Infrastructure, medical aid, education, not charity, but real, lasting change. And for the first time in his life, he felt purpose. The letter. The first snowfall had come early that year. The wind howled outside as Emily stacked firewood against the side of the cabin, her breath curling in the cold air. The routine was the same: work, survival, life moving forward. But something wasn't the same, because every morning, she found herself glancing at the trail where Richard had disappeared. And every night, she turned the small silver compass over in her hands, staring at it for far too long. Martha noticed, of course. "He's not coming back," her grandmother said one evening, stirring the pot of stew over the fire. Emily didn't look up. "I never said he was." Martha sighed, shaking her head. "You like him?" Emily scoffed. "Doesn't matter if I do. He has his world. I have mine." Martha studied her for a long moment. Then, softly, she said, "What if his world isn't what he wants anymore?" Emily didn't have an answer for that. Then, one evening, everything changed. She was outside stacking more wood when she heard it, the distant sound of sled dogs. She turned, expecting one of the village traders. But instead, a man she had never seen before stepped off the sled. Tall, dressed in a heavy coat lined with fur, his face sharp, with the air of someone who didn't belong in these parts. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sealed envelope. "Miss Dawson?" he asked. Emily nodded slowly. The man extended the letter. "This is from Richard Caldwell." Her heart slammed against her ribs. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, hesitantly, she took the envelope, the cold paper stiff in her hands. The messenger gave a small nod. "He's waiting for you." Emily swallowed hard, staring at the letter. Richard hadn't forgotten her, and now, for the first time, it was her turn to decide where she belonged. New York was unlike anything Emily had ever seen. The moment she stepped off the plane, she felt the city pressing in around her. Loud, relentless, electric. Towering skyscrapers stretched high above, disappearing into a sky that was thick with the glow of neon lights and the restless hum of endless movement. The streets were alive, pulsing with energy. People moved fast, their faces focused, their bodies weaving through the chaos of honking cabs, flashing billboards, and an atmosphere that never seemed to rest. Emily felt small. She had thought she was prepared. She had told herself that she wouldn't be intimidated. But standing there in the heart of it all, she realized how different her world truly was. She clutched the envelope in her hands, Richard's letter folded and refolded so many times it was starting to wear at the edges. She had read it again and again, trying to understand what had made her come here. But she already knew the answer. She took a deep breath and stepped into the waiting car. The drive to the penthouse was silent, tense. The city blurred past the tinted windows, a maze of glass and steel, wealth and power. And then, finally, the car pulled to a stop in front of an impossibly tall building, sleek and modern, stretching toward the sky like it had been built to defy the world itself. She hesitated only for a moment before stepping out. Inside, the lobby gleamed with polished marble, gold accents, and a kind of cold elegance that made her feel even more out of place. The elevator ride was smooth, soundless, and far too quick. Then the doors slid open, and there he was. Richard stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, hands in his pockets, gazing out at the city. He was dressed in a tailored suit, his dark hair neatly styled. Every inch the billionaire he had once been before Alaska had torn him apart and rebuilt him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he turned, and when their eyes met, something shifted in his expression. He let out a slow breath, like he'd been holding it ever since she left. Emily. Her heart stumbled. He looked the same, and yet he didn't. There was something different in his eyes, something she had never seen in him before. She squared her shoulders, stepping forward. "You wrote to me." Richard nodded, his voice softer now. "I told you I'd come back." He exhaled, shaking his head. "When I realized I couldn't, I had to bring you to me." Emily looked around the penthouse. Polished marble floors, walls of glass overlooking the city, a view that stretched for miles. It was another world, a world she didn't belong to. Richard must have noticed the hesitation in her eyes because he took a step closer. "I know it's a lot," he admitted. "I know this isn't your home." He paused, searching her face. "But I didn't bring you here to impress you." Emily met his gaze. "Then why did you bring me here?" Richard hesitated, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked uncertain. Then, with quiet conviction, he said, "Because I needed you to see the man I used to be." She crossed her arms, waiting, and his jaw tightened. "And I don't want to be that man anymore." Silence stretched between them, the city buzzing just beyond the glass. Emily watched him carefully. "You told me once that money meant everything to you." He held her gaze. "I was wrong." She raised an eyebrow. "That easy, huh?" Richard exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Nothing about this has been easy. You showed me that there's more to life than what I've spent years chasing. You made me see that power, money, all of it, it means nothing if you don't have something real." He stepped closer, his voice quieter now. "And you, Emily, you're the realest thing I've ever known." Emily's throat tightened, but she kept her expression guarded. "You think you can just say all of that, and I'll believe you?" Richard let out a soft chuckle, but there was no amusement in it. "I wouldn't expect you to." He took a breath, as if steadying himself. Then, meeting her gaze, he said, "Tell me how to prove it." Emily's heart pounded. She hadn't expected that. She had expected him to convince her, to try to explain why he belonged in her life. But instead, he was asking her how. She swallowed hard, then, with quiet resolve, said the only thing that mattered. "If you love me, Richard," she whispered, "then prove it." Richard stilled. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then something in his expression changed, a decision made. Without another word, he turned away, walked to the window, stared out at the city like he was seeing it for the last time. Then, softly, he said, "All right." Emily frowned. "All right, what?" He turned back to her, his expression firm. "Certain. I'll prove it." She tilted her head. "And how exactly are you planning to do that?" Richard took a deep breath. And then, in a voice that left no room for doubt, he said, "I'm leaving New York." Emily blinked. For a moment, she thought she had misheard him. "You what?" He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "I'm done. With all of it. The business, the power plays, the empty life I built for myself. His voice was steady, unwavering. I'm not asking you to stay in this world, Emily, because the truth is, I don't want to be in it either. She stared at him, her pulse hammering in her ears. You're serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. Emily searched his face, looking for any sign of doubt, any hesitation. She found none. Where will you go? She asked, her voice quieter now. Richard smiled. I think you already know the answer. And in that moment, she did. The first time Richard stepped back into the Alaskan wilderness, he knew this was where he belonged. The cold bit at his skin, the wind howled through the pines, but none of it unsettled him the way it once had. He had left New York behind, walked away from everything he had once believed made him who he was. And for the first time in his life, he felt free. The journey back to the village was long, but he welcomed it. The plane landed in Fairbanks, but from there, he traveled like a man earning his place. No private jets, no luxury transport, just him, a small team of sled dogs, and a guide who knew the land better than any GPS ever could. When he finally arrived, standing at the edge of the familiar tree line, it hit him. He had left as a billionaire. He had returned as something else entirely. The village was the same, small, isolated, tucked between the towering peaks like it had been forgotten by time. Smoke curled from chimneys, the scent of burning wood filling the crisp air. But the moment Richard stepped into the clearing, every conversation, every sound stopped. They recognized him. The man who had once been lost. The man who had left. The man who had come back. Emily stood near the cabin, arms crossed, her breath curling in the cold air. Her green eyes met his, unreadable, steady as ever. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Richard smiled. Emily arched an eyebrow. Took you long enough, city boy. Richard chuckled, exhaling as he shook his head. Yeah, he murmured. I guess it did. He stayed. It wasn't easy. The first few weeks were brutal, a test of everything he had learned, everything he still had to prove. Martha made sure he worked for his place. No special treatment, no shortcuts. She handed him an axe that first morning and simply said, if you're staying, you earn your keep. And he did. He chopped wood until his muscles ached, carried water from the frozen stream until his fingers went numb. He tried hunting again and failed spectacularly. You hesitate, you lose, Emily reminded him, shaking her head as his arrow went wide again. Richard groaned, rubbing his forehead. I'm never going to get the hang of this. Emily smirked. Well, lucky for you, I'm not letting you starve. He found something in those simple, honest struggles that no business deal had ever given him. The satisfaction of earning warmth in the middle of winter, of working alongside people who saw value in effort rather than money. He learned how to read the land, how to track in the snow, how to listen to the heartbeat of the wilderness rather than the ticking of a clock. And Emily, God, Emily, she never made it easy. She didn't soften, didn't melt just because he had come back. She watched him, waiting to see if he was really here to stay. But as the days passed, she saw it. The way he never complained, never backed down from the work, never expected anything in return. He had once been a man who measured his worth by the deals he closed, the numbers in his bank account. Now, he measured it by how much wood he had stacked before the first snowfall, how steady his hands were when he set the snares, how deeply he slept after a day of honest work. And then, one night, beneath a sky painted in green and violet light, he turned to her. Emily stood beside him near the river's edge, her breath curling in the icy air. The northern lights shimmered above them, reflected in the glassy surface of the frozen water. Richard exhaled slowly, his hands in his pockets, his heart hammering against his ribs. Then, softly, he asked, "Can I stay?" Emily turned to face him fully. Her expression was steady, but her eyes softened. For a long moment, she just looked at him, as if measuring the weight of his words. Then, finally, she smiled. "Yeah," she whispered. A breath he hadn't realized he was holding escaped. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "You can stay." And just like that, Richard Caldwell, once a man who thought he had everything, finally found what it meant to have a home. The nights in Alaska were long, quiet, and endless in their beauty. The sky stretched above like a vast canvas, painted with swirling ribbons of green and violet, the northern lights dancing across the horizon. Richard stood outside the cabin, his breath curling in the cold air, watching the lights shift and pulse like a living thing. He had never seen anything like it before. Not from the top of his high-rise penthouse, not from the balcony of some five-star resort, not from anywhere in the world he had once thought was his kingdom. Here, in this quiet, untamed place, he felt something settle deep within him. A certainty. He had spent his life chasing things that never mattered. Power, success, money. He had thought they would fill the emptiness inside him. But now he knew. True wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in moments. In the crackling of a fire on a freezing night. In the steady rhythm of chopping wood before the first snowfall. In the warmth of a hand reaching for his in the dark. He had come to Alaska a broken man. A man who had been betrayed, left for dead, stripped of everything he thought defined him. He had stayed because he had been given something far greater than a second chance. He had been given a reason to stay. Richard turned, his gaze drifting to the cabin behind him. Through the frosted window, he could see Emily, seated at the wooden table, her head bent slightly as she sewed a small tear in her coat. Strong, unshaken, a woman who had never needed rescuing but had, without realizing it, rescued him. She had been the one to find him, half frozen and broken in the snow. The one who had dragged him back to life, kicking and screaming. The one who had shown him, piece by piece, what it truly meant to live. He had once believed that love was a transaction, that people only cared for you if you had something to offer. Emily had never asked him for anything, and yet she had given him everything. A place to belong, a reason to wake up each morning, a home. His chest tightened, not with doubt but with something deeper, something that had settled there the moment she had said, "Yeah, you can stay." Richard exhaled slowly, feeling the final remnants of his old life slip away into the cold night air. He had spent so long believing he had everything, but only now did he understand what it truly meant to have enough. He turned back to the sky one last time, watching the auroras shimmer overhead. Then, with a quiet smile, he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't searching anymore. He was finally home. True riches come not from what we own, but from the people who stand beside us. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of love, resilience, and the unexpected beauty of human connection. Because sometimes, the most valuable things in life aren't things at all.